Hello all, today we're talking about a series of weapons that are near and dear to my heart, because, oh man, I've been asking for these things since like the dawn of time, and just somewhat recently, we actually got them with the Bayvel update 3 months ago. We're talking about the beautiful throwing knife, and the corresponding knife belt that you can, put a bunch of throwing knives in. So, how do you get throwing knives? Because we're going to talk about how to get them, we're going to talk about their pros and cons, and we're going to talk about use case scenarios. They're very simple to get. They're very, very simple to get. All you need is expert smithing, which is relatively easy to grind nowadays. You need one ingot, and you need one log. You can amass these pretty quickly. I've made like 100 of them in like a couple hours. They're very easy to get. And if you've got a storage alt, which you should have because alts are free now, or you've got enough bank space, you can stow a bunch of these away. They're really, really easy to get, and I definitely recommend getting them because you don't even need a knife belt to just have a throwing knife, right? So let's say I don't have a knife belt, right? I still just have a throwing knife equipped in my hotbar, and I can throw it, whenever I need it. It's a very effective tool in melee combat. So definitely get yourself at least a throwing knife. There's no detriment to bringing a throwing knife. Now, what there are potential detriments to is bringing a knife belt, and so we're going to get into these. If you have expert leatherworking and a wolf pelt and a ingot, you can go over to one of the tanning racks here, like the one there on Rupert, and you can make yourself a throwing knife belt, or I call them throwing knife bandoliers because they're bandoliers, but they don't actually take the place of your bandolier, they take the place of your munition pouch, or quiver, or bolt quiver, which does actually have some problems with it, like associated with it, and so this is a good time to get into the pros and cons. We'll start with the cons first, because it makes more sense to do so. If you've got a knife belt equipped, as you see I have 3 here, if you've got one of them equipped, it means you don't have any munition pouch, or quiver, or bolt quiver, whatever, equipped on you. You don't have one equipped, which means unless you have loose lead balls, or arrows, or bolts, whatever, equipped in your... unless you have loose ammo in your inventory, you can't reload your guns at all. So you have to have loose ammo in your inventory if you've got a knife belt equipped. Now this has its own set of problems too, because for starters, every weapon reload, whether it's a bow or a gun, will be 2 seconds longer because you've got loose ammo and it's not coming from a pouch. And all of this can be looted off of you. That's the second con. All of this can be looted off of you. That's why people use pouches instead of just carrying loose ammo around. And so those are really the big drawbacks. The other small drawback to these things is they're really hard to learn. This is by far the hardest throwable melee to learn the trajectory of, Tomahawks and hatchets are the easiest. Those you can learn in a matter of minutes. Spears are relatively difficult. But these guys, these are like little darts, and they're incredibly hard to learn how to throw effectively without like several hours of practice. You should practice with these things because they're, by far the hardest of the throwable melees to get like the throw pattern down right, because you've got to use different parts of the aiming reticle depending on the range you're throwing at. So those are the cons, right? They're hard to learn, and they demand you have loose lead in your inventory or loose arrows or whatever the fuck, because you need to load your guns. And so, yeah, they slow gun reload down. You'll have loose ammo in your inventory, and they're kind of hard to learn. Those are the cons. The pros, though, are huge. The pros are enormous with these things, especially if you've got yourself a fourth throwing knife, because what you could do is you can have 3 throwing knives in your bandolier and a 4th in your hotbar like this. And then you can just spam them in a duel. Not in a duel. Sorry, you can spam them in a melee fight, I just threw 4 of these things, and each of them does 50 damage. That's insane. That's 200 damage just with this bandolier. It's incredibly effective. Now, obviously, you don't need a 4th knife. You can do this with 3 just as well. But that's awesome. That's a ton of damage. That is a ton of damage you're putting out. And if you're in a hypothetical scenario where you've both fired your guns off, if you're in like a 1v1, and it's down to the melee engagement, right? You're blocking, attacking, whatever. Throwing knives are so handy. Throwing knives are great. They enable you to 2v1. They're really, really good. So that's the cons. Now, let's talk about use case scenarios. Sorry, not con. Those are the pros, not the cons. It has a lot of small cons and one massive pro, which is that it makes you really, really good in melee combat. Yeah, this is phenomenal in melee combat. Okay, yeah, so pros. Sorry. God damn it. Sorry. Use case scenarios. Let's talk about when these are the most effective, right? Now, it goes without saying that a gun, right, a secondary, a primary, these are all going to be better to use in most scenarios, but once you've fired your two guns off, right, once your shots are fired off, or once your opponent's shots are fired off and your shots, like, once the guns are out of the picture and it's a melee fight, that's when you bring out the throwing knives. They are super, super good for that. You basically control the melee fight when it comes down to, your melee or your knives. And that is the best time to use throwing knives. They're not very good when you've got like a throwing knife versus like a Jaeger or a Prussian, or a Blunder. You don't have an advantage when it comes to throwing knife v gun, but when it comes to throwing knife v, some other jackass's melee, you're gonna win a lot more times. And that's really when these things shine. It when it comes down to, oh, my guns are out, oh, their guns are out, we could duke it out with our bayonets and great axes or whatever the hell, not great axes suck. Boarding axes and such. Or, I could throw this beautiful little dart at my opponent and instantly take a half of his health. These are incredibly viable in melee engagements, but I wouldn't recommend using them until you're in a melee engagement. Don't use them in place of guns, alright? Use them when you're in a melee fight. And I'd imagine they're pretty useful in faction settings, although they really, really shine for solo player, Solo players benefit greatly from these things. They're incredibly useful for solo players in specific. They enable you to take on more people, and that's a really big thing as a solo player. So that's what I love about these little weapons. They have their cons, they're hard to use, and they mess with your ammo, and they are taking the spot of your munition pouch. But they give a lot of benefits. These are really good little weapons, and if you haven't started trying to use them, I recommend it, because they're just really good little weapons. They are incredibly effective when it comes to dueling. Sorry, I keep saying dueling. Don't use these in dueling, that's an asshole move, sorry. When it comes to melee fighting, they are incredibly, incredibly effective. And so that's what I recommend. Thank you all for listening to my TED Talk on the beauty that is throwing knives and the knife belt.